Hello, I am Teresa Gano, Project Associate for Lifetime Learning in UVA's Office of Engagement. We have people from 31 states, the District of Columbia, and several countries registered for today's presentation, the Clean Water Act at 50, New Challenges Around the Bend. We are thrilled to welcome you, and I am eager to learn right along with you. We received many questions in advance of this program. Should you have a question during the program, please add it to the Q&A box. Our speakers will answer as many questions as time permits. We are recording this event and we'll post it on our website in a couple of weeks. We are fortunate to have three University of Virginia environmental experts with us today: Jonathan Cannon, Karen McGlathry, and Kel Jaffe. Jonathan Cannon will facilitate today's conversation, and I would like to introduce him now. Jonathan John Cannon is the Blaine T. Phillips Distinguished Professor of Environmental Law Emeritus at the University of Virginia School of Law. Before coming to UVA in 1998, John held various positions at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, including General Counsel from 1995 to 1998, and Assistant Administrator for Administration and Resources Management and Chief Financial Officer from 1993 to 1995. He is the author of Environment in the Balance, the Green Movement, and the Supreme Court, as well as numerous articles on the Clean Water Act and its applications. We are excited to learn during the next hour. John, we welcome you to this Lifetime Learning Engaging the Mind program, and the microphone is all yours.
Thanks very much, Tricia, and thanks all of you for coming and joining us today. Looking forward to a robust discussion. We're going to talk today about one of the most successful pieces of environmental legislation in the federal canon. This statute was adopted decades ago, but it's had an enormous effect on the quality of the nation's waters, and it is truly something to celebrate on its 50th anniversary. At the same time, there is more work to be done under this statute, more work to be done achieving good water quality throughout the nation. And we're going to have a chance to talk about what the steps for that might be. So to get things started, I'm going to share my screen here. So this act, as I mentioned, was adopted in 1972 over the veto of then President Nixon. And that means, that's an important fact, because that means that there were enough members in Congress who were in favor of this act, Republican and Democrat, to override a presidential veto. And that means that at that time, at least, there was broad political consensus in support of this act. We wonder whether that consensus would be possible today, even for something as seemingly mom and apple pie as healthy lakes, streams, and rivers. The act was passed 3 years after floating debris in Cleveland's Cuyahoga River caught fire and burned for 20 minutes before firefighters could put it out. Rivers so filthy they caught fire, caught the national imagination, and from that, so the story goes, the Clean Water Act was born. Actually, the Cuyahoga River had been catching fire for decades. It was an industrial river lined with paper mills and steel plants and oil refineries. But when it caught fire in 1969, probably for a number of reasons, people began to react in a way that led them to want to do something to change the situation. And that happened at the beginning of the environmental movement, and the fire became a cultural symbol that really helped get the act passed. The act has ambitious goals and strong tools for dealing with some, but not all, of the threats to aquatic ecosystems. Its overall objective, and this is important, is to preserve the integrity of the nation's waters. Water quality that provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the waters. And it also has this ecosystemic approach, which, as odd as it might seem, is quite unusual among environmental statutes and much to be admired. So you ask, I hope you ask, how we're doing in achieving these lofty goals? Well, this is an image of the Potomac River in happier days before it was closed in 1932 because of pollution. President Lyndon Johnson called the river a national disgrace at this point. But because of the act and because of the regulatory machinery that has been implemented under the act to address sewage treatment plants and combined sewer overflow systems, among other sources of pollutants, progress has been made. Here's an image of swimmers in the nation's triathlon, which features a mile-long swim in the Potomac River. And that triathlon was begun in the early decades of this century. And hundreds of participants in those events, and I was one of them, swallowed a lot of river water without apparent ill effect. So the pollution programs that had been in effect then for decades were having their impact. Now and then the river still had to be closed, preventing the race, and swimming in the river is still generally prohibited, but there's a petition now pending for the mayor of DC to declare the rivers swimmable. And even more dramatic improvements have been experienced in other urbanized and industrialized rivers, creating a real noticeable improvement in major watersheds throughout the country. So the act does not regulate, and Karen's going to go into this in a lot more detail, but just to sketch it out, the act does not regulate non-point sources. So the major improvements have occurred in the point source discharges, think pipes and discrete conveyances, while non-point source discharges, which are not regulated under the act, have continued to produce problems. They are now, non-point source discharges, not regulated under the act, are the primary reason that many lakes and rivers and streams in the United States do not meet water quality standards. Big issue remaining under the act. The other big issue remaining under the act is what the act actually covers. That is, what the regulatory provisions of the Clean Water Act actually apply to. The act regulatory jurisdiction extends to navigable waters, which are traditionally defined as waters that can sustain commerce or are capable of sustaining commerce. The act defines navigable waters as waters of the United States, which people understand is somewhat broader than the traditional navigable waters, but how much broader is a big question. And then there is this large, or not so large, depending on how you view it, category of things that might be waters that still don't fall within the definition of waters of the United States. The act is 40 years old or 50 years old now, and we still don't know exactly what it applies to. It's a tribute perhaps to the endless machinations of lawyers or the vagueness of the statutory language or some of both. But Cale Jaffe is going to talk about this more in a minute. Retreat from my share screen and give a short summary and then introduce our panelists. We have an act to be proud of. It's achieved a lot of significant environmental improvement over the decades, but it's an act that also continues to present issues and challenges. So we're going to have plenty to talk about today. And to get that discussion going, I'm going to introduce our two panelists. Karen McGlathery is a professor of environmental sciences, director of UVA's Environmental Resilience Institute, and also director of the Virginia Coast Reserve Long-Term Ecological Research Project. Her bio's in the notice. I'm not going to repeat it. It's quite impressive. But I just want to say that Karen is really a star among environmental faculty at EPA, not just for her influential research on coastal systems, but also for her sustained leadership in fostering interdisciplinary approaches to environmental studies. That's a lot like herding cats, but she's done it with grace and good humor and persistence and vision. Cale Jaffe is a professor of law and director of the Environmental Law and Community Engagement Clinic. I could brag that Cale is a former student of mine, but he's one of those former students whose mastery and creativity in the field far exceed anything that I could claim credit for. As a legal scholar, he is an insightful commentator on the issues of the day. As clinic director, he has produced real environmental gains across a number of fronts, from addressing toxic sites to protecting public parkland, and most recently, as he'll discuss today, protecting EPA's jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act in a case now pending before the Supreme Court. So it is with great pleasure that I turn this over to Cale Jaffe to tell us more about what's going on under the Clean Water Act.
Thank you so much, John. And it's an honor to share the virtual stage with you. John's been a mentor of mine since literally day one of law school. I knew he was here. We had the former Clinton EPA general counsel on the faculty, and I think I went as a new first-year law student to his office to see if I could volunteer as a research assistant. So it's cool to get to share the stage with him today. I want to talk about, with my presentation, about a little bit about sort of the history, not just of the Clean Water Act that John has already covered, but about a current challenge to the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, how far its protections reach. That's currently pending right now before the Supreme Court of the United States. It's a case called Sackett versus EPA. So we'll get into that case in just a little bit. But first, before I do that, I want to reemphasize something that John mentioned, which is on sort of the history of the Clean Air Act and what it has done so far. So the Clean Water Act, the text of the act, talks about a goal of restoring and maintaining the chemical and physical and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So what does that mean, to restore the biological integrity of the nation's waters? Why was that a goal of Congress? Well, as John gave you a hint at with images of the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, it was a significant problem in the middle half of the 20th century. Here's an image of the Potomac River again in Earth Day 1970, April 1970, cleaning trash out of the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. And to just give you a flavor for what was really going on at the time, I found this wonderful New York Times story from 1970 that talked about pollution in the Potomac River in DC, and it just gives you a great flavor for what was going on. So I'll read from that New York Times story right now. The article begins, "The heat of summer is enveloping the nation's capital, and with it has come the annual resurgence of a problem that residents have come increasingly to dread, a stomach-churning miasma rising from the Potomac River." And the article went on to talk about sludge deposits that blanketed fish spawning grounds, talked about obnoxious odors seeping out from those sludge deposits on the banks of the river. And so, as you saw from John's success as a triathlete and swimmer in the Potomac River, we've largely succeeded in putting that stomach churning miasma aside, turning away from that history, and largely succeeded with the goal of making the Potomac River and other similar water bodies fishable and swimmable. But let me put it this way. So critical to that success, of course, is not just protecting the water bodies themselves, but protecting the wetlands, the tributaries, the streams that sort of feed into those water bodies. And it's not just the water itself, but you've got to get where the source of pollution might generate and make sure that that pollution doesn't make its way to our nation's waters. So the way the Clean Water Act tries to do that is it talks about, as John mentioned, the navigable waters, but then it defines the navigable waters more broadly to include the waters of the United States. So what are the waters of the United States? Well, going back at least to 1977, the early days of the Clean Water Act, the waters of the United States have included wetlands and tributaries and other sort of resources like that that have a direct connection to water quality, to those navigable waters. If you destroy a wetland, if you dump pollution into a tributary, it's going to impact water quality downstream. And so those wetlands that are connected to, that have this sort of inextricable link with the navigable water, have been protected as waters of the United States. And in fact, the Supreme Court came up with a wonderful phrase to think about this back in a case from 2001, a case called, that's known as SWANK. It's an acronym that stands for Solid Waste Authority of Northern Cook County. The SWANK case, Justice Kennedy in that case coined the term significant nexus. So whenever you've got a significant nexus between the wetland and the navigable water, you're going to be protected by the Clean Water Act. You're looking for that significant nexus. And understanding sort of the challenges with interpreting and applying the significant nexus test leads us to the challenge that's before the court today. That is the Sackett case that I mentioned, Sackett versus EPA. It's a case that is rising out of Idaho at a place called Priest Lake. And these are some iconic images of Priest Lake, Idaho, from the University of Idaho's historic library of resources on Priest Lake. So the case begins with a couple, Michael and Chantal Sackett, who own a construction and excavation business around Priest Lake, and they wanted to develop a parcel adjacent to the lake to build a vacation house. And of course, the parcel was full of wetlands. It was a wet aquatic resource. So they began dumping sand and gravel into the site to firm up the property, create a housing plan, and hopefully build a water view home. The property at issue in the Sackett case sits just about 300 feet from the edge of the water. Now, as you can see from these images, these historic images of Priest Lake here, Priest Lake has been labeled the crown jewel of Idaho. It's a 23,000 acre water body. It's become an international tourist destination. Travel writer story that I found, again, a New York Times article, talked about it as a skinny Lake Tahoe. And in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the economy was struggling, it was actually tourism at Priest Lake that led Idaho's economic recovery out of the pandemic. So it's a critical role to the economy today. And it's not just today, it's historically been a great economic engine for Idaho and for the region. In fact, in the early 20th century, the Great Northern Railroad Company built a line from urban areas out to the lake to promote tourism at the lake. And we found some of the law students I was working with on this project found some of the old newspaper ads and tourism ads from the railroad company that advertised it as a place of man-sized thrills. I'm not sure what a man-sized thrill, I didn't know how you measure the height of thrills in any event, but that's how they advertised at the time, man-sized thrills to come to this iconic destination of Priest Lake. And so like many before them, the Sacketts wanted to enjoy Priest Lake and the opportunities it presents for fishing and boating and swimming. But they wanted to do so by dredging and destroying the wetlands that fed directly into Priest Lake. And so part of their argument is that the Clean Water Act should not cover wetlands that have a significant nexus to a water body, but just merely those that physically abut. If you're not physically abutting a water body, you should not be covered. So I had the great fortune, as this controversy was beginning to develop, or as continuing to develop, because the case has gone on for a number of years now. But I had the great fortune to work with some law students here at UVA. We represented, in this case before the Supreme Court of the United States, we're representing the Idaho Conservation League in filing a friend of the court brief, or an amicus brief as it's called. And the Idaho Conservation League has really turned out to be a great client for us. They are a significant environmental group in Idaho. They were founded in 1973, just 1 year after the Clean Water Act was enacted. It's a group of biologists and geologists and resource managers, folks working throughout the state of Idaho, but also with an office just a couple of miles from Priest Lake. And it may very well be that one of the volunteers or members of the Idaho Conservation League first alerted EPA to the unlawful dredging of wetlands at the Priest Lake site. And so one of the things that we wanted to do with our brief to the Supreme Court of the United States was we wanted to sort of highlight exactly, we wanted to share the lay of the land that our client really knew. So we worked here, you can see a map. This is an excerpt straight from our brief here, where we noted that there was this historic, incredible wetland resource, the Kalispell Bay Fen, that historically flowed all the way to the banks of the Priest Lake. And in fact, even to this day, the Kalispell Bay Fen is still spawning habitat for trout. We found studies documenting its connection via groundwater directly to Priest Lake via a tributary that has since been channelized to get around a road that you can see there to Priest Lake. So through surface water connections, groundwater connections, through the spawning habitat for trout, the Sackett property you can see there and the Kalispell Bay Fen have been really inextricably tied to water quality at Priest Lake. But one question that the Sacketts have raised, and as you can see from this picture, is, well, there's been some intermediate development right against the shores of Priest Lake. And they said that those homes in front of them, closer to the shore, the Sacketts have argued, should break the chain of connection between the wetlands and the lake. They said, in other words, as I mentioned before, only wetlands that physically abut the lake should be protected. Their wetlands are not close enough to fall within the Act's purview, according to their argument. We countered, of course, that the wetlands are inextricably tied to water quality in the lake. And we got to sort of watch this play out during oral argument. So our class got together, we had worked on the brief to the Supreme Court of the United States. We then listened live to oral argument from the court, and were able to sort of comment on it. The oral argument was just a couple of weeks ago on October 3rd. And this issue that we had highlighted, talking about sort of the adjacency of the wetlands and the inextricable link of the wetlands to water quality of the lake, came up during oral argument. And this whole debate over whether wetlands that abut are protected, or whether more wetlands than that, whether wetlands that are adjacent but a little farther afield are also protected, came up at oral argument. So as we were listening live to it, there was one moment in the oral argument that really jumped out to my students and to me that I want to share with you now. So I'm going to stop sharing my slideshow and switch over to sharing a little snippet from the oral argument in Sackett. And you're going to hear here, first you'll hear Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, then you'll briefly hear the Sackett's lawyer, and then you'll hear Justice Sonia Sotomayor. So here's the issue that sort of popped up for my students.
So why didn't Congress say immediately adjacent? If they were trying to achieve something different than what the regulations had said about adjacency, if they were balancing their concerns about protecting the integrity of the navigable waters with the property interests in the state's rights to control it, why didn't they say immediately adjacent in terms of the wetlands coverage?
Justice Jackson.
A footnote. Why didn't they use the word they use elsewhere, abutting?
Abutting.
Well, Justice Jackson, I don't believe the term abutting appears in the statute, but one reason why—
Oh, it actually does. Assume it does. There are other sections that use the word abutting.
All right, you heard it there. a tough moment for the lawyer representing the Sacketts in questioning. And I will say that the Sackett's lawyer received similarly tough questions from some of the judge's noted conservatives. Justice Kavanaugh had some very tough questions for the Sackett's attorney, as did Justice Barrett. And if we have time during the Q&A, we can get into that. But I will end by saying that based on how oral argument went, my students and I think we all came away cautiously optimistic that some broader protection for wetlands will survive the Supreme Court's review here. The significant nexus test that Justice Kennedy laid out, it's hard to say what will happen with that, but I think we're cautiously optimistic about some broader protections. So to understand what's really at stake here, and to get into the science behind it all, I want to turn it over to Karen McGlathery to dig into this a little more deeply. So Karen, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Cale. Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be here with you to discuss this issue. I'm going to share my screen now. So as Cale mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the science behind the Clean Water Act. I'm an environmental scientist. I've been working on water quality for my entire career. I currently do research on the eastern shore of Virginia, where we have actually shown that the presence of vast wetlands have maintained very high water quality there for the last 40 years. The had a data record. So I wanted to start with this map because it identifies two iconic water bodies that have both recovered greatly in response to the Clean Water Act, but also have some sort of latent issues that address what both John and Cale brought up earlier. I am going to focus on a certain aspect of pollution into these waters. I'll be focusing on nitrogen and phosphorus pollution that comes from a variety of sources. And this is the area where, again, I've done most of my research. And so excess nitrogen and phosphorus that comes either from the landscape or actually from the atmosphere into water bodies, whether it's a stream, a river, a lake, or an estuary, can be a problem. Too much nitrogen and phosphorus is essentially over fertilizes these water bodies and can fuel the growth of harmful algal blooms. And those can be a problem for two reasons. One, they can produce toxins, like we'll see in Lake Erie, the Lake Erie example. But also when these algal blooms grow and when the algae die and sink to the bottom, the decomposition of the algae by bacteria will use up oxygen. These can create these what we call dead zones in these water bodies. And those dead zones can't support fish or any other marine plants. And so to take Lake Erie as an example, so Lake Erie once was referred to as being dead. It has recovered over the decades since the Clean Water Act was enacted. And that's in large part from regulating the point sources that John mentioned, industrial and wastewater nutrient inputs. But since the 2000s, we have seen the occurrence of seasonal toxic algal blooms. So these are algal blooms you can see in that inset picture, that bright green. This is from a remote satellite image that creates a liver toxin that's dangerous both to human and wildlife, and also impacts the water supply for about 11 million people around Lake Erie. And so scientists, we believe that these algal blooms are largely the result of increased fertilizer use on the land and farmland that drains into the streams and into Lake Erie. And so that's, again, an example of the sort of non-point source pollution that John mentioned. And I'll talk about that, the distinction in a minute. The other system that we know a lot about, is an iconic water body, is an estuary, also controlled by the Clean Water Act regulations, the Chesapeake Bay that we all know well. And since the mid-1980s, the amount of nitrogen entering the bay has reduced by about 25% and the amount of phosphorus by about 8%. As a result of regulations on what we call total maximum daily loads, the amount of nutrients that can be released into the Chesapeake Bay. And I show a picture inset here of a underwater seagrass meadow. It's like a prairie underwater. This is what I focused my research on. And these seagrasses are like sentinels or coastal canaries, we like to call them. They're sentinels of water quality. When the water quality is bad and there's low oxygen and a lot of algae in the water column. They can't get enough light to be supported. And so their populations will decline. And they did. In the 1970s, there was a tremendous decline of underwater seagrass throughout the bay. And then just in the last recent years, maybe there's about 10 years ago, they have increased by about 300%. I'm sorry, not 30%, but 300%. So really, really successful recovery of seagrass because of an increase in water quality. So as John mentioned in the opening remarks, there have been tremendous successes in improving water quality in a lot of these water bodies, but there's still a lot to be done. Estimates are between a third and a half of US water bodies, again, rivers, lakes, streams, estuaries, are impaired. And that means that they're too to meet standards for swimming and recreation, aquatic life, and fish consumption, and also drinking water sources. And so to understand this a little bit better, I just want to give you just a really brief introduction to the different kinds of pollution, nutrient pollution that enter these water bodies. The first is what we call point sources. And again, John referred to this in his opening remarks. These are sources of nutrients that come from a single conveyance, a single point, like a wastewater treatment plant, which you see on your screen to the right, or industrial wastewater, which you see on the left. As John mentioned, treatment of these is highly effective. We do a good job of controlling nutrient inputs from these sources. Using the Chesapeake Bay example, limiting pollution from these sources has decreased the amount of nitrogen going into Chesapeake by over half, and for phosphorus by about 75% over the last 30 years. So very effective. But the thing that's harder to control and the harder to regulate and harder to get a handle on are these non-point sources. So the big examples of non-point sources are urban and suburban runoff, nutrients, other say from fertilizing a lawn, other nutrients coming off of an urban system, and also farmland. So manure and fertilizer application to farmland. And the key thing about these, we use the term runoff because rainfall, heavy rainfall, causes a lot of flow of water that brings the nutrients into water bodies. Now it can go into a stream that eventually feeds into a lake, or eventually feeds into an estuary, or can go directly into those larger water bodies. So imagine a city street when there's a heavy rainfall, all that water is going into a sewer system, stormwater sewers, and that goes out into, say, the Chesapeake Bay, or the creek in your backyard that really swells after a big rain event. And so that rainwater washes those nutrients into the coastal waters. And so this is the most difficult to manage. It's harder to identify, harder to address. Many people don't understand the role of their actions and how whether they're in a watershed that feeds into a water body. And as John mentioned, this is really the primary reason why the regulations have not, in some cases, reached the goals for improving water quality. And I want to just give the Chesapeake Bay as an example. In the blue line is the outline of the watershed. It covers 6 states, all the way 524 miles from Cooperstown in the northern part of the watershed in New York, all the way down to Norfolk. And it covers about 64,000 square miles. So it's just massive. 18 million people live in the watershed. So all the activities on the land in those watersheds will feed into tributaries that eventually, streams and rivers that eventually feed into the Chesapeake Bay. So if I'm in Cooperstown, New York, and farming on my farm fields, what I do influences the Chesapeake Bay much further south from me. And so to the right shows you just a very simple pie diagram that shows for the Chesapeake Bay about almost 50% of the nutrient pollution of all sources, almost 50% comes from agriculture. Okay, so the fact that everything is feeding off the land into these water bodies points to wetlands as being extremely important in regulating nutrient input and water quality to lakes and to rivers and to estuaries. Wetlands are exceptional sort of natural filters that remove nutrients. Some are bound in the biomass of the plants and the leaves of the plants. Some of it is is turned by bacteria into atmospheric nitrogen, for example, that gets lost from the system. So what goes in is much higher than what comes out. And so this is an example of a vast coastal marsh on the eastern shore of Virginia, where I work. And we've shown again that the wetlands are really important in improving water quality. But it doesn't stop there. We also get a lot of other benefits from wetlands. That includes protecting shorelines from erosion and also providing wildlife habitat, as Cale mentioned. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing now. And I just wanted to end again, the sort of three main points is that we've made great progress, but we still have a ways to go. Controlling point source pollution it's much more effective and easier than non-point. So that's really the holy grail that we have to deal with. And wetlands are essential in terms of regulating water quality in all waters of the United States. And so I'm going to now, John and Cale will join.
All right, well, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Cale. Those were great examinations of particular problems that are actually central to the current challenges that we face under the Clean Water Act, and it's great to hear your insights and experience with them. So we're going to move now to some questions that we received from our audience, and some of them we received in advance, and some of them are still coming in our Q&A. If you have a question on your mind, I encourage you to submit it to Q&A, and we'll try to pick it up if we can. I wanted to start with the first question that we got in the Q&A, because I think it's an interesting one. The writer says, looking back, do you see any connection between the Clean Water Act and the reduction of domestic manufacturing and industry in the United States? And do you think there will be more challenges to the Clean Water Act and the current push to increase made in the USA? I mean, this is a question that could be raised with a number of the federal environmental statutes that impose regulations on domestic enterprises. And I'd be interested in your insights. None of us are experts in international economics, but I would welcome your insights on whether you think the Clean Water Act has had an effect, how much of an effect, and whether that's likely to be an issue in the future.
So I'll jump in, John, this is Cale, and say that I don't think there's, well, let me flip the question a little bit and ask whether a push to move more manufacturing to the United States to emphasize made in the USA, whether that poses a threat to Clean Water Act protections that, as we documented, have been significant. And I would say I don't think there's a direct threat, but there may be sort of an indirect chain. So when you think about one of the sort of the hot debates right now in terms of Senator Manchin's proposed bill on permitting reform is the idea of sort of streamlining federal permitting more broadly. And what's really interesting about that is to realize how many federal laws are very intentionally by congressional design sort of daisy chained together. So if waters are jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act, obviously is critical to protecting wetlands and water quality, but that permitting process might also trigger additional reviews under the National Environmental Policy Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, biological consultation under the Endangered Species Act. So the way that the federal environmental scheme is daisy chained together, or since this is a Clean Water Act discussion, the way that these acts have a ripple effect from one effect into the other might very well be at stake as we sort of move into permitting reform, that we reform one area where you streamline permitting one area, it has impacts across a variety of acts.
Karen, do you have any thoughts?
I'm going to pass on this one, John.
All right. Pass is accepted, absolutely. Here's another one that I think is interesting and sort of challenging at a macro level. Most citizens would say they support a cleaner environment, but there are those who push against regulations. Why and who do these people represent? And I might put the question a little differently. I think there is a real tension in all of these statutes between a desire to achieve a better environment and concerns about the constraints of regulation. In the case of the Clean Air Act, the public opinion polls show continuing strong support for the goals of the Clean Water Act. And that support has been continuous all along for this particular statute. So that shows that suggests that people value what the Clean Water Act is doing, but that of course comes at a cost. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on the balance between achieving the goals and maintaining a reasonable level of cost in order to be able to do that. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a good bit of evidence that another driver for economic development is quality of life, is water quality. So especially for employees who have some mobility, economic mobility, to be able to move for the job that they'd like, that data demonstrate that those workers prioritize a high quality of life. I remember several years ago, I was down in Southern Virginia, in Halifax County. I had the chance to talk with the CEO of the Halifax Regional Hospital, and he mentioned that he emphasized quality of life as how he drew doctors and nurses and physician's assistants and other medical professionals to come work at his hospital. He said, we don't have all the museums that Washington, D.C. might have. We don't have a big college football team like Charlottesville or Blacksburg might have, but we do have a great quality of life on either on the Dan River or on the Bannister River, so resources right near Halifax County that for him were important resources to be able to leverage to encourage development and encourage folks to move to that community.
I would just add, John, that, from my experience, 30 years, some odd years working on the Eastern Shore, that working with local citizens there, and thinking about the value of coastal wetlands to sea level rise, for example, and development. And one of the things that came out from these various conversations over the decades is how much that those wetlands add to the quality of life, just that, as Cale said. So and it's not as tangible as an economic value of an increase in fish population. It also can be an aesthetic value. It can be an appreciation of the role of these wetlands in producing these clean waters that are off the Eastern Shore. I think for me, the biggest challenge when I think about something like the lagoons off the Eastern Shore of Virginia versus the Chesapeake Bay is it's easier to connect with the value of a wetland when it's in your backyard. It's more difficult to connect to the value of what you do in Pennsylvania to countryside to what's happening in the Chesapeake Bay. So somehow making those connections more explicit and informative, and so that that can help sort of increase the appreciation for decisions that people are making.
So coming back at this at a somewhat different point of view, I was interested in your comment, which I believe I interpreted correctly. You'll tell me if I didn't. That the major problems remaining in water quality are due to non-point sources, and that non-point source controls may be cheaper, significantly cheaper than point source controls. So does that suggest that there is a least cost way of proceeding if we can focus on non-point source pollution that will gain us significant improvements in water quality, but at a price that people will think is reasonable or fair?
Yeah, I think there's both sort of nature-based solutions like we talked about with protecting wetlands, not just ones that are adjacent to a water body, but wetlands in an entire watershed that influence the quality of water going in. But also actions of different kinds of farming practices that if we understood more about when the how much fertilizer needs to be added in order to optimally produce a crop, but not have excess, right, that will wash off into water bodies, or timing of application of fertilizers. When I worked in Denmark for a number of years, farmers used to disperse manure on the landscape in the winter because that was just a way to get rid of it, and then it would be there ready in the spring when the crops would be ready to go. And part of regulation that happened in that country was to prevent that from happening and to change the timing of the manure application, and that was enough to show significant improvements in water quality in the coastal bays and lagoons. So, I think there's a lot that can be still done and investigated to think about how, these could be much lower cost, fairly technologically simple approaches to improving water quality in large areas.
Great. Okay. So I have a provocative one here. So these are federal, the Clean Water Act is a federal act. It has a big role for states, and that role has been extremely important over time. But here's the question: why shouldn't primary regulatory authority be at state and local levels? In other words, scientifically and ethically defend supremacy of federal regulation. I mean, the Clean Water Act is an act of Congress, and it authorizes two federal agencies to issue regulations that are binding. States can be more demanding, but they can't be less demanding generally under these statutes. Why do we have this rather than something more state-oriented or local-oriented that could deal with water bodies on a case-by-case or place-by-place basis?
Well, I think Karen gave us sort of a great example of why we need federal water quality protections with her slide presentations. When you look at the Chesapeake Bay watershed and you realize just how far it reaches beyond what we think, we think of the Bay States, we think of Virginia, we think of Maryland, we think of Delaware, but Pennsylvania in the Susquehanna River is a huge role in protecting water quality, even as Karen mentioned, all the way up into New York. I had the chance recently to talk with someone with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation who was explaining that it can be hard to convince Pennsylvania state legislators to invest in bay protections because they don't really see it as their resource. They would manage the cost of controlling pollution, but the benefits would be downstream at the Chesapeake Bay for Maryland or Delaware or Virginia. And so Clean Water Act protections for the Chesapeake Bay are critical because that brings everybody together to work on values that really adhere to all of us, a resource that adheres to all of us at a national level. Karen, I don't know if you have more to say on that. I mean, you articulated so beautifully during your presentation.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. I think there's a disconnect between the cost and benefits, at a local and a regional level. And so I think you could not protect the Chesapeake Bay if you didn't have some kind of federal regulation that makes states, work together.
Okay. So here's a question that takes us off in a slightly different direction, but I think it's an important one. We've talked about the jurisdictional reach of the Clean Water Act as extending to waters of the United States. But generally, those waters have been interpreted to be surface waters only. And the act has not been interpreted to reach discharges to groundwater, although there has been some recent action by the Supreme Court on that. And here's the question: aquifer protection is important to my community, that is protecting the underground sources of water. What effect did the Supreme Court Maui decision have on future protections of subsurface waters? Cale, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. So the question is referring to another Supreme Court case under the Clean Water Act from just a couple of years ago called County of Maui versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund. I worked with again with my students on a friend of the court brief in that case. Happen to have a copy of it right here. We represented the counties of Anderson County, South Carolina, and Decatur County, Tennessee, in that County of Maui case. And what the court ultimately concluded in that case was, yes, we're talking about the navigable waters, the Potomac River, Priest Lake, Idaho. Those are the iconic waters that the act protects, and we don't want discharges directly into those waters to pollute them. But what the court realized, and Justice Breyer articulated the test for this, is destruction of groundwater or pollution of groundwater or pollution of aquifers that is the functional equivalent of running a pipe to Priest Lake or to the Potomac River, that functional equivalent pollution is also protected by the Clean Water Act. So, we still are seeing how that functional equivalency test gets implemented and how it plays out. But the key piece there, which is actually a similar issue to the Sackett case, is understanding how these sort of hydrologically connected systems work. So the research that someone like Karen is doing is critical to the development of the law, because it's helping us understand, that what starts in the groundwater doesn't necessarily stay in the groundwater, and it moves to Priest Lake, it moves to the Potomac River. That's what the functional equivalency test in County of Maui highlighted, and that's, I think, sort of the governing standard going forward for that particular issue.
And I would just add that groundwater is always on the move, just like stream waters and river waters are on the move. And so you have groundwater that's receiving pollutants in one location and it's moving. There's a surface groundwater and a deeper groundwater, and that water is moving down slope. And so you get a lot of direct flow of groundwater into a river or lake or an estuary. And in some places that can be the dominant flow. For example, in the sandy soils of the Eastern Shore, we don't have a lot of surface flow. Most of it percolates down into the surface aquifer and then out. And so if you don't account for that, you're missing a lot of the ways that nutrients can get into receiving water bodies.
Okay. So I've been saving this question for last. It may not be exactly the last, but it's an opportunity to kind of summarize our views and distill them for people who are watching. So what do you foresee are the greatest challenges for implementing the Clean Water Act over the next 5 years and over the next 50 years? What's the biggest challenge and what's the biggest opportunity? Karen, I'll go to you first on that.
Sure.
Because I know you've got several.
Well, not too many. I mean, I guess I would absolutely say that the greatest challenge is to better manage non-point source pollution. And there are many aspects of that we've talked about, from understanding how what we do on the land influences the source of those nutrients and whether we can change our behavior. It's increasing awareness. It's understanding the chemistry and the physics of water movement and the biological transformations. We really need to know more about that. We can't clean up the Chesapeake Bay unless we get that 45%, and we won't ever meet our goals. So to me, that's the biggest challenge. One thing we don't often think about is, and this is not regulated by the Clean Water Act, but it affects the water quality, is that we have nutrients. We have nitrogen coming in from the air. Air pollution that's delivering nitrogen to water bodies. And so that's a corollary. It's not the Clean Water Act, but it is related to one of the challenges. Again, another kind of diffuse source of nutrients that come into coastal waters.
Yeah, that's a good point. Makes it even more complicated. Cale, what's on your top of your list?
For me, I think I would highlight that we need to be vigilant not to become victims of our own success. that the farther, I think, you started in your slideshow, and I included a little bit in my presentation as well, with some images of pre-Clean Water Act pollution, because it's so easy to forget how bad things were 50 years ago before enactment of the Clean Water Act. If we were talking about the Clean Air Act, we might have brought up, instead of the Cuyahoga River fire, we probably would have talked about the Donora, Pennsylvania death fog from around Halloween. I think it was 1948 or thereabouts. But a pollution event from industrial facilities in Donora, Pennsylvania, that literally killed people and sent several more to the hospital because of uncontrolled air pollution. So I think as we get farther and farther away from the enactment of these iconic laws like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, that we forget how much they've delivered, and we begin to take those successes for granted.
I think that is a danger, absolutely. And I would say, keying off Karen's answer, I would say that non-point source, a key target, and new methods, and Karen's been involved in these intimately, new methods for addressing those sources. They're not going to be dealt with in the top-down regulatory way that we have dealt with point source pollution. We have to develop collaborative approaches and incentive programs and information programs that are effective on the ground in getting people to change behavior without threatening a civil fine or an injunction. And that is more difficult. It takes time, it takes energy, and it takes grassroots effort. And we still are learning how to do that effectively. Chesapeake Bay is a good example of efforts to do that, and has had some significant success, but we need to be able to develop that pattern and see it implemented elsewhere too.
John, could I add one last thing? As you were talking, made me think. We haven't talked about concentrated animal operations, and those are often like chicken farms and others are thought of as point source, but they can also be non-point source. You can have runoff into groundwater. We can also have hurricanes that can impact. There's a famous picture of one of the hurricanes that hit North Carolina, and hogs were hog farms had overflowed, the holding ponds had overflowed. So sort of understanding the vulnerability of some of these point sources as well, I think, is really important.
Right. So I think maybe we have time for one more question, and this is relevant to how we connect with our local communities. The question is, how has the Clean Water Act benefited Virginia recently? The question is, please give current examples of how Virginia benefits from the Clean Water Act.
I could give one super quick example, which is, the underwater seagrass meadows that are near and dear to my heart, and the recovery of seagrass meadows because of improved water quality has had a positive impact on blue crab populations. They're a nursery ground also for other commercially important fish. So many fish species depend on these healthy ecosystems, and they depend on the good water quality, and that's benefited people in Virginia.
I would just say, if you've spent some time in the Charlottesville area and you've gone down and gone tubing on the James River, and you rubbed your feet along on the rocks on the bottom and knocked off a few of those little freshwater mussels, that you're seeing the benefits of the Clean Water Act, that the health of the James River is really inextricably tied to federal and state water quality protections.
And I think we could say the same of the Rivanna and the tributaries of the Rivanna and wetlands adjacent to those tributaries as well.
And I know we're out of time before Tricia takes it away from us. I saw several former colleagues and friends in the Q&A, and my email for anyone is easily accessible on the law school's website. I'd be happy to continue the conversation with folks. Shoot me an email. Yeah,
I should say that there's some great questions in the Q&A that we weren't able to get to. So I'm sorry about that, but time is limited.
It is indeed. Thank you. That shows the interest and involvement, does it not? Thank you, John, Karen, and Kale, for this informative presentation and for engaging with the audience in these great Q&A segments. We look forward to future updates and information on the future of clean water in our communities, nation, and the world. We are very appreciative of your time and expertise. We also would like to thank the UVA Office of Sustainability for their partnership in today's Lifetime Learning event. And thank you for your participation today. Fall remains a busy season in the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement, and we invite you to join us for future programming, both in person and online. You can find specific details and registration links to upcoming programs, faculty blogs, podcasts, and vodcasts at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. From all of us at Lifetime Learning, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to our next shared learning opportunity with you, and we wish you a great rest of your day.